The coffee shop fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the laughter exploded. Alan sat motionless, watching Colleen navigate the narrow aisles between tables, her breathing labored, her floral dress catching on chair backs. Phones appeared like predators. Cameras clicked in rhythm. His friends Randy and Greg were doubled over at their corner table, slapping the wood surface, tears of mockery streaming down their reddened faces. This was the setup, the joke, the punchline they'd been orchestrating all week. A broke mechanic in a borrowed shirt meets a woman they'd only described as having a wonderful personality. Everyone saw it. The mismatch, the cruelty disguised as charity, the entertainment at two people's expense. But when Alan rose slowly from his seat, smoothed down his wrinkled collar with calloused fingers, and pulled out her chair with the reverence of a man greeting someone precious, the laughter faltered. Cracks appeared. Because nobody in that packed cafe could have predicted what this forgotten father with oil-stained hands was about to say. Alan Mitchell had never been good at saying no to his friends. That was how he'd ended up here, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the garage, where he spent 60 hours a week lying under broken cars, trying to stretch $14 an hour into rent, groceries, and everything a 7-year-old girl needed to feel normal. His daughter Zoe was the reason he woke up at 5:30 every morning, the reason he wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, the reason he hadn't given up when his wife Lauren died 3 years ago, leaving him with a mortgage he couldn't afford and a child who still asked why mommy wasn't coming home. He'd sold the house within 6 months, moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots punctuated weekend nights, and learned to cook macaroni 14 different ways because it was cheap, and Zoe would eat it without complaining. The garage where Alan worked was owned by a man named Frank, who'd given him the job out of pity after Lauren's funeral, and Alan had never missed a day since. He was good with his hands, patient with broken things, able to see solutions where other mechanics saw only problems. Frank paid him less than he deserved, but never said so, and Alan never asked for more because he knew desperation showed on a man's face like a scar, and scars made people uncomfortable. His co-workers were younger, louder, the kind of men who drank beer after shifts and complained about wives who didn't understand them. Alan went home to Zoe, helped her with homework at their kitchen table with the wobbly leg, read her the same 3 library books she requested every week, and tucked her into bed with a kiss on the forehead that felt like a prayer he didn't know the words to anymore. Randy and Greg weren't co-workers. They were friends from before, from when Lauren was alive, and they'd all gone to barbecues together, back when Alan had been a different person who laughed easily and didn't count pennies at the grocery store. They'd stuck around after the funeral in that awkward way people do, showing up every few months with pizza or offering to take Zoe to the park so Alan could have a break he never asked for. Lately, though, their visits had shifted. They'd started making comments about how long it had been, how Alan needed to get back out there, how Lauren would have wanted him to be happy. Alan never responded to these suggestions, because responding would mean admitting they were right, and admitting they were right would mean confronting the fact that he'd stopped being a whole person the day Lauren died, that he'd become just a father and a mechanic and nothing else, and that terrified him more than being alone. Last Tuesday, Randy had cornered him in the garage parking lot after his shift. "We found someone for you," he'd said, grinning like he'd just solved all of Alan's problems. "Her name's Colleen. She's sweet, works at the community kitchen downtown, loves kids. Greg's wife knows her from church." Alan had tried to refuse, said he wasn't ready, said Zoe needed him home, said a dozen other things that all meant the same thing. He was scared. But Randy had persisted, and then Greg had joined in, and their jokes had gotten sharper, their laughter louder, until Alan felt like he was being backed into a corner by people who claimed to care about him. "Come on, man," Greg had said, clapping him on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Beggars can't be choosers, right? We're doing you a favor here. The words had stung, but Alan had nodded anyway, because that was what he did. He absorbed other people's cruelty and pretended it didn't hurt. That night, Zoe had overheard him on the phone with Randy, finalizing the details of the date. She'd appeared in his bedroom doorway in her unicorn pajamas, clutching the stuffed rabbit Lauren had given her before the hospital visits had become permanent. "Daddy, are you going to meet someone?" she'd asked, her voice small and hopeful. Alan had knelt down to her level, brushed hair from her forehead, and tried to explain that it was just dinner. Just friends being pushy, nothing important. But Zoe had smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks, and said, "Mommy told me before she went to heaven that you have the kindest heart in the whole world." She said someone else would see it too someday. Alan had held his daughter then, feeling something crack open inside his chest, and decided that maybe he could try, if only because Zoe believed in him the way Lauren used to. Friday arrived too quickly. Alan borrowed a shirt from Randy, a pale blue button-down that was slightly too big in the shoulders, but cleaner than anything he owned. He shaved carefully, nicking his jaw twice because his hands were shaking, and used the cologne Lauren had bought him for their last anniversary together. The bottle still 3/4 full because he'd never had anywhere to wear it. Zoe sat on the bathroom counter, swinging her legs and offering commentary on his appearance. "You look handsome, Daddy," she said, and Alan wanted to believe her, but couldn't shake the feeling that he looked like a man playing dress-up in someone else's life. He'd counted the cash in his wallet 3 times, $42, enough for coffee and maybe a sandwich if Colleen was hungry, enough to leave a decent tip so the server wouldn't look at him with pity. The coffee shop Randy had chosen was called The Daily Grind, a place Alan had driven past 100 times, but never entered, because their prices were listed in whole dollars, and his budget was calculated in quarters. He arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a black coffee he couldn't taste, and sat at the table Randy had reserved near the window where everyone could see him. The chair was uncomfortable, the kind that made you shift positions every few minutes, and Alan wondered if that was intentional, if coffee shops designed their furniture to keep people moving so they'd buy more drinks. He watched the door, watched people come and go, watched the barista make complicated drinks with syrups and foams that cost more than his lunch, and tried not to think about how much easier it would be to just leave. Randy and Greg showed up 15 minutes before Colleen was supposed to arrive. They'd promised to give him space, to let him handle the date alone, but there they were, sliding into a table in the corner, with ridiculous grins on their faces, like they were about to watch a show they'd paid good money to see. Randy caught Alan's eye and gave him a thumbs up. Greg mouthed something that looked like, "Good luck," but his expression suggested he didn't mean it kindly. Alan felt his stomach twist, felt the first whisper of understanding that something was wrong here, that his friends hadn't arranged this date out of kindness, but out of something else, something meaner. He should have left. He should have stood up, walked out, driven home to Zoe, and spent the evening reading library books on their second-hand couch. But he didn't, because leaving would mean admitting defeat. And Alan had spent 3 years teaching himself how to endure things he couldn't change. The door opened at exactly 6 o'clock. Alan looked up. Time performed one of those strange tricks where it moved too fast and too slow simultaneously, where every detail became sharp enough to cut. The woman who entered was large, not just overweight, but obese, in a way that made simple movements complicated. Her floral dress was pretty, Alan noticed, yellow with small white flowers, but it strained across her middle and caught on a chair back as she tried to navigate the narrow aisle between tables. Her face was flushed, whether from exertion or embarrassment, Alan couldn't tell, and her eyes were scanning the room with an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself 1,000 times, the look of someone expecting rejection and trying to prepare for it in advance. The coffee shop fell silent. Not completely. The espresso machine still hissed, the acoustic guitar music still played from hidden speakers, but the human sounds stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. And then the laughter started. It began with a woman at the table nearest the door, a sharp bark of surprise that she tried to disguise as a cough. Then her companion joined in, less subtle, and suddenly it was spreading through the room like a fire catching dry wood. Randy and Greg's laughter was the loudest, unrestrained, and cruel, the sound of men who'd orchestrated something they found hilarious. Phones appeared. People weren't even trying to be subtle about it. They were openly filming, capturing what they clearly believed was entertainment, a spectacle they could share later with the caption, "You won't believe what we saw today." Colleen stood frozen near the door, her eyes finding Alan's across the room. In that moment, Alan saw everything. The way her shoulders hunched forward, as if she could make herself smaller. The trembling in her hands as she clutched her purse. The way her mouth opened slightly like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. He saw the girl she must have been before the world taught her to hate herself. Saw the woman she was trying to be, despite everything conspiring against her. Saw the human being who'd agreed to this date, probably for the same reason he had. Because loneliness was heavy, and hope was stubborn, even when it shouldn't be. And in seeing her, Alan saw himself too. Saw the broken mechanic in borrowed clothes who'd let his friends treat him like a joke, who'd almost walked out, who'd forgotten somewhere along the way that dignity wasn't something you needed money to afford. He stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, loud in the shocked silence. Alan didn't look at Randy and Greg. He didn't look at the people filming. He looked only at Colleen, walked toward her through the parted tables, and when he reached her, he smiled. Not a forced smile, not the polite grimace people wore when they were trying to be kind. A real smile, warm and genuine. The kind he used to give Zoe when she showed him drawings from school. "Colleen?" he asked, and his voice came out steady, even though his heart was hammering. "I'm Alan. I'm really glad you came." He offered his arm, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it, her hand shaking against his borrowed sleeve. Together, they walked back to the table, Alan moving slowly to match her pace, and when they arrived, he pulled out her chair and waited until she was seated, before taking his own seat across from her. The laughter had diminished to uncertain murmurs. People were still watching, still filming, but something had shifted. Alan ignored them all. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his focus entirely on Colleen, and said, "I apologize in advance for anything my friends might have told you about me." They have a strange sense of humor. Colleen's laugh was quiet, nervous, but real. "They told me you were a mechanic," she said, "and that you had a daughter." Her voice was soft, musical almost, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who sang lullabies to children or read stories aloud. Alan nodded. "Zoe, she's 7. She's the best thing that ever happened to me." He paused, then added, "What do you do, Colleen?" And just like that, despite everything, they began to talk. Colleen worked at the community kitchen on 5th Street, the one that served hot meals to anyone who walked through the door without asking questions. She'd been volunteering there for 5 years, had eventually been hired part-time to coordinate donations and manage the schedule. She talked about the children who came in with their parents, how she kept a box of crayons and paper at her station so they'd have something to do while their families ate, how some of the kids would draw pictures for her that she'd hang on the refrigerator in her tiny studio apartment. "I was one of those kids once," she said quietly. "My mom and we spent 2 years moving between shelters after my dad left. The kitchen volunteers were the only people who treated us like we mattered. So, I guess I'm trying to pay that forward." Alan listened, really listened, the way he used to listen to Lauren when she'd tell him about her day teaching kindergarten. He learned that Colleen had grown up in foster care after her mother died, that she'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a social worker's phone number she'd never called. She'd worked fast food, retail, cleaning offices at night, whatever would pay rent and keep her fed. She'd tried community college, but couldn't afford to continue after the first semester. She read library books on her lunch breaks, donated blood for the extra cash, and had never been on a vacation that required an airplane. Her life was small and hard and lonely, but she told it without self-pity, just facts delivered in that gentle voice that made Alan want to protect her from every person who'd ever made her feel less than she was. He told her about Lauren, about the cancer that had appeared without warning and spread too fast for prayers or medicine to stop, about watching the woman he loved disappear piece by piece until the person in the hospital bed was a stranger wearing his wife's face. He told her about the medical bills that still arrived sometimes, about choosing between Zoe's winter coat and the electric bill, about learning to cut his daughter's hair using YouTube tutorials because salon appointments cost $40. He told her things he'd never said aloud, not to Randy or Greg, or even to Frank at the garage, and Colleen listened with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in years. "You're a good father," she said when he finished, and the certainty in her voice made his throat tighten. Around them, the coffee shop had returned to its normal rhythm. Most people had gone back to their conversations, their laptops, their own lives. But Randy and Greg remained at their corner table, watching with expressions that had shifted from amusement to something more confused. And there were still a few customers who kept glancing over, phones out, but no longer filming. Alan and Colleen talked for 40 minutes without interruption, their coffee growing cold between them. And somewhere in that conversation, Alan felt something loosen inside him, some knot of loneliness he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. He hadn't expected to like her. He'd expected awkwardness, pity maybe, the forced politeness of two people thrown together by circumstances neither had chosen. Instead, he'd found someone who understood what it meant to survive, who'd learned the same lessons he had about grace, under pressure, and dignity despite circumstances. "Can I ask you something?" Colleen said, her voice dropping lower. "Did your friends tell you about me? I mean, did they describe what I looked like?" Alan considered lying. Considered protecting Randy and Greg because that was what he'd always done. Absorbed their cruelty so they wouldn't have to face it. But Colleen deserved better than his cowardice. "They said you had a wonderful personality," he answered carefully. "They didn't mention anything else. I don't think they thought they needed to." Colleen's smile was sad, but unsurprised. "They set us both up, didn't they? The poor guy and the fat girl. Like we're both so desperate, we should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection we can get." Alan felt anger rise in his chest, hot and unfamiliar, because she was right, and he'd been too naive or too trusting to see it. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the cafe's ambient noise. "Dude, how's the date going?" It was Randy, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. His tone dripping with false concern. "Your girlfriend treating you right." Greg laughed beside him, that braying sound Alan had heard 100 times before, but never recognized as cruel until now. Other people started to pay attention again, sensing entertainment. A young man at the next table leaned toward his friend and said, not bothering to lower his voice, "I give them credit for trying. Must be hard when you're both at the bottom of the barrel." His companion snickered. "Yeah, I mean, what else are they gonna do, right? At least they've found each other." The comments multiplied. A woman in yoga clothes stage whispered to her friend about letting yourself go like that, while staring directly at Colleen. Two college-age kids were openly filming now, one of them narrating for their social media audience. "Guys, you have to see this. It's like a charity date or something." Someone else made a joke about whether the chairs were rated for that much weight. The laughter built again, louder than before, meaner, and Alan watched Colleen's face drain of color. Her hands were shaking. She set down her coffee cup carefully, precisely, like she was afraid if she moved too quickly something would shatter. "I should go," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come. This was a mistake." She started to stand, and Alan felt something fundamental shift inside him. He'd spent 3 years being quiet, being careful, making himself small so other people would be comfortable. He'd let Randy and Greg make jokes at his expense. He'd let the landlord ignore the broken heater because complaining might mean eviction. He'd let the manager at the grocery store give him expired milk because poor people couldn't be picky. He'd absorbed disrespect and cruelty and indifference until he'd almost convinced himself that was all he deserved. But watching Colleen prepare to walk out of this cafe with her dignity in tatters because a room full of strangers had decided her body was public property to mock, something in Alan broke. Or maybe it was something that finally healed. He reached across the table and gently took her hand. "Please don't go," he said. "Not yet." Colleen looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and Alan saw in her face the same question he'd been asking himself for 3 years. Why should I keep trying when the world has made it clear I don't matter? He stood up, still holding her hand, and turned to face the room. The cafe fell silent again. Randy and Greg stopped laughing. The college kids stopped filming. Everyone watched, waiting to see what the poor mechanic in the borrowed shirt would do next. Alan's voice when he spoke was quiet, but in that silence, it carried to every corner of the room. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "Cancer. We couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved her because our insurance wouldn't cover experimental procedures, and I was making $12 an hour trying to keep us afloat. I held her hand while she died, and then I went home to our 7-year-old daughter and tried to explain why Mommy wasn't coming back. I've spent 3 years working 60-hour weeks at a garage, coming home to a daughter who still cries for her mother at night, eating pasta for dinner because it's all I can afford, and wearing the same 3 shirts because I can't justify buying new clothes when Zoe needs shoes." He paused, swallowing hard against the emotion rising in his throat. No one moved. "My friends Randy and Greg over there set up this date. They thought it would be funny, I guess. The poor desperate guy and the overweight woman, 2 people so pathetic they should be grateful anyone would consider them at all. And you all laughed. You filmed us like we're animals in a zoo, like our lives are entertainment for you to consume and mock. You made jokes about her body, about my circumstances, about whether we're worthy of basic human respect." His grip on Colleen's hand tightened slightly. "But you know what I found in the last hour? I found someone who understands what it means to keep going when everything tells you to quit. Someone who works at a community kitchen feeding hungry children because she remembers being one of those children. Someone who reads library books because she can't afford to buy them but refuses to let poverty steal her dreams. Someone who agreed to this date, even though she probably knew it might be a setup, because hope is harder to kill than cruelty." Alan looked directly at Randy and Greg, saw the shame starting to bloom on their faces. "Colleen has more character in her smallest gesture than anyone in this room has shown tonight. She's kind, she's compassionate. She survived things that would have broken most of you. And when she walked through that door and faced your mockery, your cruelty, your casual dehumanization, she still tried to be gracious. She still tried to give me a chance despite knowing I might be part of the joke." His voice grew stronger, steadier. "My wife Lauren told me something before she died. She said, 'Beauty fades, Alan. Bodies change. But kindness stays. Character stays. Choose someone who knows how to be kind when being cruel is easier.' Colleen is that person. And if you can't see that because you're too busy judging her body, too busy congratulating yourselves for having better circumstances, too busy treating human beings like they're content for your entertainment, then you're the ones who should be ashamed." The silence that followed was absolute. Alan heard the espresso machine hissing, heard traffic outside the window, heard his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He saw tears streaming down Colleen's face. But they weren't tears of humiliation now. They were something else, something that looked almost like relief. He saw the woman in yoga clothes staring at her lap, her face red. He saw the college kids slowly lowering their phones. He saw Randy with his head in his hands, and Greg looking like he might be sick. And then, from a table near the back, an older woman stood up. She was in her 60s maybe, gray-haired and dignified, and she started to clap. Slowly at first, then with increasing conviction. Others joined her. Not everyone. Some people were still frozen in shock or shame, but enough. Enough that the applause built into something real, something that filled the space where mockery had been. Randy and Greg approached the table slowly, hesitantly, like men walking toward their own execution. Randy's eyes were red-rimmed. "Alan," he started, then stopped, seeming to realize there were no words adequate for what he'd done. "We're sorry," Greg finished lamely. You thought it would be funny," Alan interrupted. "You thought my loneliness and her body were entertainment. You thought because I'm poor and she's overweight that we'd be so desperate for companionship we wouldn't notice we were the punchline." Randy nodded miserably. "We're assholes," he said. "Complete assholes. We don't deserve your friendship." Alan looked at them for a long moment. These were men he'd known for years, men who'd been at his wedding, men who'd carried Lauren's casket at her funeral. But they were also men who'd forgotten somewhere along the way that kindness mattered more than entertainment, that people weren't props for their amusement. "No," Alan said quietly, "you don't. Not right now. Maybe someday, if you learn from this. But right now, I need you to leave." Randy and Greg left without argument, shoulders hunched, and Alan hoped they'd spend the rest of the night feeling even a fraction of the shame they'd inflicted. Other customers approached after that. The older woman who'd started the applause, a young couple who apologized for not speaking up sooner, even one of the college kids who'd been filming, his phone now in his pocket, and his face stricken with guilt. Colleen accepted their apologies with grace. Alan found astounding given what she'd endured. When they were finally alone again, Alan sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you," Colleen said, and her voice was steady now, stronger. "No one has ever—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider. "No one has ever stood up for me like that. Most people don't even see me. I'm just the fat girl, you know? Invisible, except when I'm useful as a joke or a cautionary tale. But you saw me. You defended me. You made them see me, too." Alan reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "You're not invisible," he said firmly. "And you're not a joke. You're a good person who deserves respect and kindness and every good thing this world has to offer. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." They left the cafe together half an hour later, after the crowd had thinned, and the manager had quietly comped their coffee with an apologetic look that suggested she'd seen the whole thing and felt complicit in not stopping it sooner. Alan walked Colleen to the bus stop 3 blocks away, their pace slow and comfortable. Their conversation drifting to lighter topics, favorite books, childhood memories, the small pleasures that made hard lives bearable. When the bus arrived, Colleen turned to face him. "Would you want to do this again?" she asked. "Not here, obviously. Maybe somewhere quieter. I'd like to meet Zoe, if that's okay. I'd like to hear more about Lauren, too. I think she sounds like she was an amazing person." Alan felt something warm expand in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I'd like that," he said. "Zoe would love you. She's been asking when I'd find someone who could see my kind heart." He smiled, remembering his daughter's words. I guess she was right. Colleen hugged him before boarding the bus, a quick embrace that smelled like vanilla and something floral. And Alan stood on the sidewalk watching the bus disappear into traffic, feeling more alive than he had in 3 years. He pulled out his phone and texted Zoe's babysitter that he'd be home in 20 minutes. Then he started walking, his borrowed shirt slightly rumpled, his wallet still containing most of the $42 he'd brought, his heart considerably fuller, than when he'd left home. The walk home took 30 minutes, but Alan didn't mind. He needed the time to process what had happened, to understand the shift that had occurred, not just in the cafe but inside himself. For 3 years, he'd been in survival mode, focused entirely on getting through each day, providing for Zoe, maintaining the bare minimum of existence. He'd forgotten that he was allowed to want more, to expect respect, to believe he deserved happiness. Colleen had reminded him, not through what she'd said but through who she was, someone who'd survived worse than him and still chose kindness, still chose hope, still chose to show up for a blind date, even when she probably knew it might go badly. When he reached his apartment building, Mrs. Chen from next door was sitting on the front steps, smoking a cigarette, despite the building's no-smoking policy. She was a widow in her 70s who'd taken to checking on Alan and Zoe after Lauren died, bringing them dumplings on Sundays and watching Zoe when Alan's shift ran late. "You look different," she said, studying his face in the streetlight. "Something good happen?" Alan sat down beside her. "I think maybe it did," he said. He told her about the date, about the cruelty and the laughter, about standing up and speaking truth to a room full of strangers. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she patted his knee with her weathered hand. "Your wife would be proud," she said. "She always said you were too kind for your own good. But tonight, you were kind in the right way, kind to someone who needed it, and strong enough to make others see their cruelty." Inside the apartment, Zoe was still awake despite it being past her bedtime. She launched herself at Alan the moment he opened the door, her babysitter apologizing from the couch. "I tried to get her to sleep, but she insisted on waiting up for you." Alan paid the sitter, thanked her for staying late, and once they were alone, he scooped Zoe into his arms and carried her to the couch. "Tell me about her," Zoe demanded. "What's she like? Is she nice? Did you have fun?" Alan laughed, a real laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "She's wonderful," he said honestly. "She works at a place that feeds hungry families. She loves kids. She reads lots of books. And yes, I had fun. More fun than I've had in a long time." Zoe's smile could have lit up the entire apartment. "Mommy was right," she said, snuggling against his chest. "You do have the kindest heart. And now, someone else sees it too." Alan kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, and felt tears prick his eyes. "You know what, baby?" he said softly. "I think maybe everyone has kindness in their heart. They just forget sometimes. They get scared or hurt or tired, and they forget that being kind is the most important thing we can do. But tonight, I remembered. And I think some other people remembered too." Zoe yawned, her eyes already closing. "That's good, Daddy," she murmured. "Mommy always said kindness is like a light. You shine yours, and it helps other people find theirs." Alan carried her to bed, tucked her in with the stuffed rabbit Lauren had given her, and stood in the doorway watching his daughter sleep. He thought about Colleen, about the courage it must have taken to walk into that cafe, knowing she might face exactly what she'd faced. He thought about Randy and Greg, hoped they'd learn from their shame, hoped they'd become better men because of it. He thought about the strangers who'd laughed and filmed, wondered if any of them would look at their own lives differently now. And he thought about Lauren, about the lessons she'd tried to teach him about seeing past surfaces to the substance underneath, about choosing kindness even when cruelty was easier. The following week passed in a blur of work and routine, but there was a lightness to it now, an anticipation that made even the difficult days bearable. Alan texted with Colleen every evening after putting Zoe to bed, simple messages at first, sharing details about their days, then longer conversations about everything and nothing. She sent him photos of drawings the kids at the community kitchen had made for her. He sent her pictures of Zoe's latest school project, a diorama about ocean life that had taken over their kitchen table for 3 days. They talked about meeting again, about introducing Colleen to Zoe, about taking things slowly because they'd both been hurt and both knew that healing took time. On Saturday morning, Colleen came to their apartment bearing homemade cinnamon rolls that smelled like heaven. Zoe answered the door and immediately hugged Colleen like they were old friends, and Alan watched his daughter chatter excitedly about her stuffed animal collection, while Colleen listened with genuine interest, asking questions and laughing at Zoe's elaborate backstories for each toy. They spent the morning together, the three of them, eating cinnamon rolls at the wobbly kitchen table, playing board games that Zoe always won, reading stories aloud from the library books scattered around the living room. It felt natural, comfortable, like Colleen had always been there, filling a space Alan hadn't realized was empty. After lunch, while Zoe was occupied with her coloring books, Colleen and Alan sat together on the couch, their shoulders touching, their hands loosely intertwined. "I've been thinking about what you said at the cafe," Colleen told him, "about kindness staying when everything else fades. My whole life, people have told me I need to change, lose weight, act different, be someone other than who I am. But you didn't ask me to change. You didn't see me as a problem to fix. You just saw me as a person worth defending. Do you know how rare that is?" Alan squeezed her hand. "You shouldn't have to be grateful for basic respect," he said. "That should be the default. The fact that it's not. The fact that we're both surprised when people treat us like we matter. That says more about the world than it does about us." They talked about the future in careful, tentative terms, not making promises they weren't ready to keep, but acknowledging that something real was building between them. Colleen wanted to go back to school eventually, maybe study social work so she could help kids like she'd been. Alan wanted to save enough money to move to a safer neighborhood, maybe find a better paying job, give Zoe the stability she deserved. They were both dreamers, who'd had their dreams deferred by poverty and loss and circumstance. But together, they felt like maybe those dreams weren't impossible anymore, just delayed. "Lauren used to say that hope was the most stubborn thing in the world," Alan said, pulling Colleen closer. "She said you could beat it down, bury it, ignore it, but it would always find a way to grow back. I didn't believe her after she died. I thought hope was for people who hadn't lost everything. But maybe I was wrong." Zoe climbed onto the couch between them, inserting herself into their conversation with the unself-conscious confidence of children. "Are you going to be my new mommy?" she asked Colleen directly, and Alan felt panic rise until he saw Colleen's gentle smile. "I could never replace your mommy," Colleen said seriously. "She sounds like she was very special, and nobody could ever take her place in your heart. But maybe I could be your friend, and maybe, if your dad and I keep spending time together, I could be someone who loves you and takes care of you in a different way. Would that be okay?" Zoe considered this with the gravity of a judge, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "But you have to promise to read me stories." "Daddy does funny voices, but he's not very good at them." Colleen laughed. "I promise," she said, and Alan felt something settle inside him, some last piece of resistance crumbling. The months that followed weren't easy. Poverty didn't disappear because of hope, and trauma didn't heal overnight. Alan still worked 60-hour weeks. Colleen still faced judgment and cruelty from strangers who thought her body was public property to comment on. Zoe still had nightmares about losing another parent. But they faced these challenges together. Three people who'd learned that survival was easier with allies, that kindness could be both armor and weapon, that love didn't require perfection or wealth or ideal circumstances. It only required willingness to see and be seen. Randy and Greg reached out after 6 weeks with apologies that seemed genuine, asking if Alan would consider giving them another chance. He met them for coffee at a different cafe, listened to their explanations and regrets, and accepted their apologies, not because what they'd done was forgivable, but because holding grudges required energy he'd rather spend on his daughter and Colleen. "You hurt us both," he told them flatly. "You treated us like we were jokes, like our pain was entertainment. I don't know if our friendship can recover from that, but I'm willing to see you try to be better people." They were trying, he could tell, making efforts to examine their own prejudices, to speak up when they witnessed cruelty, to understand that kindness wasn't weakness, but the hardest strength there was. One evening in early autumn, when the air had turned crisp and leaves were starting to turn, Alan took Colleen and Zoe to the cemetery where Lauren was buried. It was the first time he'd brought anyone there besides Zoe, and he felt nervous in a way he couldn't quite articulate. But Colleen held his hand as they walked through the rows of headstones, and Zoe skipped ahead to place flowers on her mother's grave like she did every month. "I wanted you to meet her," Alan said, standing before the simple marker that read, "Lauren Mitchell, beloved wife and mother. I wanted her to know that you're taking care of us in a way, that you're helping us remember how to be happy again." Colleen stood quietly for a long moment, her head bowed, and Alan wondered what she was thinking, what she might be saying in the privacy of her own mind, to a woman she'd never met, but who'd shaped so much of who he was. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Thank you for loving him so well," she said to the gravestone. "Thank you for teaching him about kindness and dignity and seeing past surfaces. Thank you for Zoe, who's one of the brightest lights I've ever met. I promise I'll take care of them. Not because I'm trying to replace you, but because they deserve to be cared for, and because you loved them enough to teach them how to recognize real love when they see it." Alan wept then, silently, tears streaming down his face as Colleen wrapped her arms around him and Zoe pressed against his leg, the three of them standing together in the fading light. He wept for Lauren, for the life they'd lost, for the years they'd never have. He wept for the struggle still ahead, for the poverty and prejudice and pain that wouldn't magically disappear. But he also wept with something that felt like gratitude, like relief, like the opening of a door he'd thought was permanently closed. "She would have liked you," he managed to say when he could speak again. "She would have loved how you stood up to that room full of people. She would have been proud." As they drove home through streets painted gold by the setting sun, Zoe asleep in the back seat and Colleen's hand warm in his, Alan thought about the coffee shop, about the moment when everything had changed. He thought about the laughter and the cameras and the cruelty, and how all of it had somehow led to this, to healing, to connection, to the slow and painful process of becoming whole again. He thought about the people who'd witnessed his speech, wondered if any of them had gone home and looked at their own lives differently, wondered if anything he'd said had lodged in their hearts the way small acts of kindness had lodged in his. The world was still hard. Money was still tight. The apartment was still too small, and in a neighborhood where sirens sang every night. But inside that small apartment was love, messy and imperfect, and built on the ruins of loss, but real. Zoe had two people who would protect her fiercely. Colleen had a family who saw her worth, and Alan had learned that standing up for what was right, for people who deserved defending, for basic human dignity in a world that too often forgot its value, that was its own kind of wealth, more valuable than anything money could buy. On a Tuesday evening 3 months after that disastrous blind date, Alan came home from work to find Colleen and Zoe in the kitchen, covered in flour and laughing hysterically at some private joke. Dinner was something that smelled incredible and was probably beyond his budget, but Colleen had insisted on cooking, had waved away his protests about cost with the kind of stubbornness he was learning to recognize and love. They ate together at the wobbly table that Alan kept meaning to fix, told stories about their days, made plans for the weekend. After dinner, while Zoe did homework, Alan and Colleen washed dishes side by side, their movements synchronized in the way of people learning to share space. "Do you ever regret it?" Colleen asked quietly, her hands buried in soapy water. "Going on that date, I mean. Putting yourself through all that humiliation for a stranger? Alan dried a plate carefully, considering his answer. I regret that it happened the way it did, he said finally. I regret that we both had to endure cruelty from people who should have known better. But regret meeting you? Regret standing up when someone needed defending? Regret finding out I was still capable of hope? He set down the plate and turned to face her fully. Never. Not even for a second. Colleen kissed him then, gentle and unhurried, and Alan kissed her back, tasting soap suds and something sweeter, feeling grateful in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with choice. The choice to show up, to be kind, to see worth in places others overlooked. From the living room, Zoe called out that she needed help with her math homework, and they broke apart laughing, returning to the ordinary chaos of their extraordinary life. Late that night, after Zoe was asleep and Colleen had gone home with promises to return on Saturday, Alan sat alone in the quiet apartment, thinking about stories and how they end. In movies, the poor mechanic would suddenly get a promotion. The widow would move to a beautiful house. The happy ending would come wrapped in prosperity and ease. But real life wasn't like that. Real life was choosing joy in the middle of struggle, finding love in unexpected places, building family from broken pieces. Real life was knowing that tomorrow he'd wake up at 5:30, work until his hands ached, count pennies at the grocery store, and still go to bed feeling rich because richness wasn't about money. It was about mattering, being seen, having people to fight for, and people who fought for you. Alan pulled out his phone and looked at the photo Colleen had sent earlier. Her and Zoe making silly faces, flower in their hair, pure happiness captured in pixels. He thought about the coffee shop, about the words that had poured out of him in defense of a woman he'd just met, about how sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to accept the world's cruelty as inevitable. He thought about Lauren's voice in his memory, telling him that kindness was the only thing that mattered in the end, that everything else was just noise and distraction from what was real. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant sirens that were as much a lullaby as anything in this neighborhood. Alan's borrowed shirt was hanging in the closet, clean and ready to return to Randy, though he'd probably keep wearing it because it reminded him of the night everything changed. His wallet still didn't hold much money. His car still made concerning noises. His future was still uncertain in all the ways futures are when you're living paycheck to paycheck in a country that punishes poverty. But he had Zoe. He had Colleen. He had proof that dignity couldn't be bought or sold, that respect was something you claimed by respecting yourself first, that love was possible even when, especially when, circumstances suggested otherwise. He thought about the people in that cafe who'd laughed and filmed and treated human suffering as entertainment. He hoped they'd learned something. He hoped they'd gone home and looked in mirrors and seen themselves clearly for the first time. But whether they had or hadn't, whether his words had mattered beyond that moment or not, Alan knew this. He'd stood up. He'd spoken truth. He'd defended someone who needed defending. And in doing so, he'd defended himself too, had reclaimed some essential part of his humanity that 3 years of survival mode had almost erased. Outside his window, the city continued its restless motion. Millions of people living millions of stories, most of them harder than they should be, most of them involving some form of struggle or loss or endurance. Alan was just one person among millions, a mechanic with oil-stained hands and a second-hand life, not particularly special or notable or destined for anything remarkable. But he'd learned something in that coffee shop, something that felt important enough to hold on to, that every person carried worth that had nothing to do with their bank account or body or circumstances, and that seeing that worth, defending it, insisting on it even when the whole world disagreed, was what made us human in the truest sense. He turned off the lights and went to check on Zoe one last time before bed, a ritual he'd maintained since Lauren died. needing to see his daughter's chest rise and fall, needing confirmation that she was safe and present, and his to protect. Zoe slept peacefully, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight, a small smile on her face, like she was dreaming of something good. Alan kissed her forehead, whispered that he loved her, and returned to his own room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, new moments of doubt. But it would also bring Colleen's good morning text, Zoe's laughter over breakfast, small joys scattered through the hardship like stars in a dark sky. And that, Alan had learned, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.